Ever wish you could just read minds? Like really know what someone else is thinking?
Uh-huh. Wouldn't that be something?
Well, get ready to dive into that very idea today.
Sounds intriguing.
We're cracking open Mindwise by Nicholas Epley,
Fascinating look at how we understand each other.
or more often, misunderstand, am I right?
Yeah, Epley really digs into how our sixth sense, that whole mind reading thing, is way more complicated than we think. And honestly, kind of funny when you look at the ways we get it wrong.
Right. We all like to think we're pretty good judges of character,
But we're often wildly off base, and Epley, he's a leading psychologist in this area, really brings that to light.
So where do we go wrong? What's the lowdown?
Well, Epley starts with a story, almost too strange to be true, about a woman, Ashley. She carved a bee.
AB. Okay, hold on. I'm already lost. What does that even mean?
It was a backward bee carved into her own face.
Wait, so she could read it herself. What's the story there?
Exactly. She claimed it was part of an attack, right? But that detail, the backward bee, well, kind of exposed a hole in her story, you know? It highlighted this thing Epley calls our egocentric bias.
Meaning, we assume everyone sees the world the same way we do.
Exactly. Like we're all walking around with the same instruction manual. Ashley forgot that a backwards bee on her face would look, well, normal to her, but not to anyone else.
Wow, that's a pretty wild example.
It is, and it shows how we project our own perspective onto others all the time, often without realizing it.
So it's not just misreading social cues. It's about this deeper assumption that everyone thinks like us.
Exactly. And Epley illustrates this with a fun experiment he did, like a real-life newlywed game.
Oh, I love that show.
Yeah.
But also, sometimes kind of cringe, you know?
Totally. So he had these couples, and they quizzed each other about all sorts of things, likes, dislikes, even their self-worth.
You ever feel like you can predict your partner's every thought? I've totally been there.
Oh, absolutely right. We all have. But that's just it. Even though these couples were married, long-term relationships, they consistently overestimated how well they knew their partner's answers.
No way. So even when you think you're mind melded with someone, you're actually way off. Tell me more about this.
It's true. The partners, they answered correctly only slightly better than chance would predict.
Wow. Seriously.
Seriously. But here's the kicker. Their confidence in their mind-reading abilities, it was through the roof. They were sure they were nailing it.
That's kind of unsettling. Like, if we're that bad at reading even our partner's minds, are we doomed to misunderstand everyone?
No, don't panic just yet. There's good news, too.
Okay, good, because I was starting to get a little concerned.
It's not all doom and gloom, I promise. We're not total disasters at this mind-reading game. Epley points out that we're actually pretty decent at understanding how people see us, on average, that is.
Okay, I need an example here. What do you mean on average?
Think of it this way. You might not know your dad's exact height to the inch, right? But
I can tell if he's tall or short.
exactly. We get the general idea, the overall impression, but when it comes to the specifics, like the nuances of someone's thoughts and feelings, well, that's where we tend to trip up.
We overestimate our ability to read the fine print, basically.
Yes. We get overconfident, just like those couples on the Newlywed Game, thinking we've got it all figured out, when in reality, we're often just projecting our own assumptions.
So how do we get better at this whole mind-reading thing? Where do we even start?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Epley, he digs into how our brains are wired, and it turns out it's kind of like a
Like what? Spill it.
construction zone.
A construction zone. Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that even mean?
Well, think about a construction site. Lots of activity, right? But you only see the finished product, not the process, all the steps it took to get there.
Okay, I get that.
It's the same with our brains. We experience our thoughts and feelings as these whole, complete ideas, but we're often clueless about all the complex, unconscious factors that went into building them.
So we're strangers to our own thought process in a way.
In a way, yeah. We see the finished building, but not the blueprints.
So if we're blind to the construction going on in our own heads, how can we be expected to understand what's going on in someone else's? Seems like a recipe for disaster.
It's a challenge, that's for sure. And to illustrate this, Epley tells this fascinating story about a sociologist in the 1930s named Richard Lapierre.
Okay, setting the scene a bit here.
Yeah, so Lapierre, he traveled across the United States with a young Asian couple.
Okay.
And this was at a time when prejudice against Asians was sadly really widespread.
Yeah, I can only imagine the kind of reception they must have gotten.
It's what you'd expect, right? Prejudice and discrimination at every turn.
Right.
And Lapierre himself, he was worried about exactly that. But surprisingly, they were treated with courtesy and respect at almost every hotel and restaurant they visited.
Wow, that's really unexpected.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did attitudes just magically change overnight?
Well, after the trip, Lapierre sent questionnaires to those same establishments, asking if they would serve Asian customers. And get this, the responses were overwhelmingly negative,
Oh, wow.
a stark contrast to the kindness they'd experienced just a few months earlier.
That is such a disconnect. It's like their stated beliefs and their actions were totally at odds.
Exactly. Their actual behavior didn't match what they said they believed. And this highlights how our brains can have these different levels, with unconscious biases influencing our behavior, even when we think we're being totally open-minded.
So are you saying we're all hypocrites walking around with these hidden prejudices?
I wouldn't go that far. Not necessarily hypocrites, but definitely prone to blind spots. We misjudge our own reactions, just like we saw in Lapierre's study, but we also fall prey to things like the planning fallacy.
Oh, tell me about it.
Right.
The planning fallacy is my life.
Right.
I'm constantly thinking things will take less time or effort than they actually do.
Right there with you. We all are, to some extent.
Oh, yeah.
Because we often don't see those complex unconscious processes that are actually shaping our decisions and behaviors.
Okay, so this is all starting to make sense, but it's also kind of daunting. If our own introspection can be so flawed, how can we ever really bridge the gap between our perceptions and reality, both within ourselves and with others?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Epley, he introduces this concept he calls naive realism. It's this tendency to see our own perceptions as objective reality, which can make it really tough when others have a different experience.
Right. It's like that old saying, arguing over the color of an apple when one person is colorblind. Everyone thinks they're right, but they're operating from totally different realities.
Exactly. And this naive realism, it can fuel disagreements on a much larger scale.
Yeah.
Think about how heated political debates can get. We demonize people who hold different views, assuming they must be biased or misguided, when it might just be a matter of perspective.
It's true. It's like we're all trapped in our own little echo chambers, surrounded by people who agree with us. And we're kind of unable to see beyond our own limited viewpoints. It feels like we're constantly bumping into each other's blind spots. So how do we break out of these echo chambers? How do we even begin to bridge that gap between these vastly different viewpoints?
Well, Epley suggests that we need to become more aware of the shortcuts our brains use to make sense of other people's minds.
Okay.
Some of these shortcuts are more reliable than others, but they can all lead to misunderstandings if we're not careful.
Okay, shortcuts. Tell me more about these. We talking about like Jedi mind tricks here? Because I'm ready to sign up.
Not quite Jedi level, but interesting nonetheless. So one shortcut is relying on visual cues. Our brains are hardwired to pick up on things like eye contact, facial expressions, body language. You can often tell if someone's happy, sad, or angry just by looking at them.
Right. It's like that whole poker face thing that people try to master.
Yeah.
But there are always those little tells, those micro expressions that kind of betray how we're really feeling.
Exactly. But even these visual cues, they're not foolproof. Think about how contagious yawning is. We yawn when we see someone else yawn, even if we're not tired. It's a social cue, not necessarily a reflection of our internal state.
Oh, that's true. I've definitely faked a yawn or two in meetings to be polite. No one needs to see how bored I am.
Another shortcut our brains use, and this one's a bit trickier, is stereotypes.
Okay.
Now, I want to be clear, stereotypes can be really dangerously misleading and often reinforce harmful biases. However, Epley argues that we shouldn't pretend that all groups are exactly the same either.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing real differences without resorting to oversimplification.
So it's about striking that delicate balance between acknowledging diversity and avoiding harmful generalizations, which is a tough line to walk.
It is tough, but it's important. And Epley challenges us to consider how nature and nurture interact to shape our perceptions. He gives this really simple but powerful example. Imagine a child asking why only dads get gray hair. Seems like a silly question, but it highlights how even our most basic observations can be influenced by societal norms and assumptions.
That's such a simple example, but it really drives home the point. These ingrained biases can be so subtle, so unconscious that we don't even realize they're shaping our thinking. It's like those optical illusions where you see one thing, but then someone points out a whole other image that's hidden in plain sight. So if these shortcuts, these visual cues and stereotypes can be so misleading, is there a better way to really, truly understand someone?
Epley argues that the key is to go beyond just trying harder to imagine someone else's perspective. It's about actively engaging with them, truly listening to their experiences, and being open to seeing the world through their eyes. even if it challenges our own beliefs.
So it's not enough to just try to imagine what someone else is going through. We have to actually engage with them, really hear them out.
Exactly. And Epley, he offers this really simple but kind of profound suggestion. Ask the question, what's it like to be you?
It seems almost too simple, like something you'd hear on a daytime talk show. Can asking one question really bridge that divide?
It can, but here's the thing. It has to be asked with genuine curiosity, a real willingness to listen without judgment. Think about how often we ask that question, but we don't really want to hear the answer.
Oh, totally. We're just going through the motions, not really present in the conversation.
Right. We're just waiting for our turn to talk instead of actually listening. And that's where the real work begins. Epley suggests that true understanding requires vulnerability, stepping outside our comfort zones, and confronting some uncomfortable truths, you know?
Because what if the answer to that question challenges our own beliefs? That's a scary thought for a lot of people.
It is. It's definitely a possibility, but it's also where the real growth happens. By confronting those uncomfortable truths, by allowing ourselves to be challenged, we open ourselves up to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of both ourselves and the world around us.
So it's not about seeking validation or trying to fit someone else's experience into our own neatly defined boxes. It's about approaching the conversation with humility, a willingness to learn.
Precisely.
Right.
And it's important to remember this isn't a one-time thing. It's about cultivating an ongoing practice of curiosity, empathy, open-mindedness. It's about recognizing that everyone we meet has a story to tell, a perspective that can enrich our own.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation, but I do have one last question for you.
Yeah.
If we all walked around constantly questioning our perceptions, wouldn't that be exhausting? Isn't there a balance to be struck between healthy skepticism and just driving ourselves crazy?
Absolutely. That's a great point. It's not about being hypercritical of ourselves or others. It's about finding that sweet spot between acknowledging the limits of our sixth sense while still appreciating the amazing capacity of the human mind to connect and understand.
So maybe it's less about trying to become perfect mind readers and more about approaching our interactions with a bit more humility and a lot more curiosity.
Exactly. And remembering that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply listen. Really listen.
This deep dive into Mindwise has given me a lot to think about and a lot to work on. It's a good reminder that the world is full of fascinating minds just waiting to be understood if we're willing to open ourselves up to the possibility. Thanks for joining us, and remember, the next time you find yourself making assumptions about someone, take a moment to ask yourself, what's it like to be them? You might be surprised by what you discover.